Hello, my name is Ali Whipple. Today I will be presenting to you a presentation on astronomy in ancient civilizations and how it affected their lives. Throughout history, many civilizations have relied on astronomy to do many things, including telling time, discovering seasons, and having gods to worship. This was important because they needed to be able to discover when they could plant their plants and when they could worship their gods and goddesses. One civilization that we are going to focus on are the Greeks. The Greeks were famous astronomers, had many famous astronomers, and they also discovered many constellations and had many myths and legends that went along with their constellations. So, we don't have enough time to cover all the famous Greek astronomers, but we're going to be covering two different famous Greek astronomers. We're going to talk about Aristarchus of Samos and Ptolemy, both very important Greek astronomers at the time. Now, Aristarchus of Samos is known for making the first heliocentric model known to the Greeks. This means he was the first to make a model of the solar system that placed the sun in the center of the solar system. This is important because many other people were making models that put the Earth at the center of the solar system, and their science was just not working out properly. Heliocentric gets its name because helio is the root for sun, as one of the gods of the sun was Helios. So he was able to place the sun in the center of the solar system. Now, I say known to the Greeks because there were some known to other civilizations, but the Greeks were not made aware of that yet. The second famous astronomer was Ptolemy. Ptolemy discovered constellations that we recognize even now as the same constellations he pointed out. Ptolemy was not the only astronomer to discover constellations, but his compilation of constellations is one that is widely recognized even now, and he was a very famous Greek astronomer in his time for having discovered these constellations and being able to group the stars together to make these constellations. So we already know constellations were discovered by Ptolemy and other scientists and used for many reasons. So constellations played a major role in ancient times for many civilizations. But right now we're going to focus on the constellations that were discovered by the Greeks and how they were used by the Greeks. So there were quite a few uses for constellations. In ancient Greece, constellations were a way to remember the heroes of old myths and inspire hope into the minds and hearts of the young. This was because constellations were often named after heroes or heroic feats that were done. For example, the constellation of Hercules or the constellation Leo, which is the Nemean lion. And this inspired hope because parents were able to teach their sons and daughters about the heroic feats of others and then point them out as constellations in the sky, because oftentimes it was a reward to be put into the sky as a constellation. So Greek myths and legends regarding astronomy. There are way too many myths and legends about ancient Greeks to cover all of them, so we're just going to take a short look into a few of them. And they're actually related to each other. The first that we're going to look at is the myth of Hercules, or Heracles. It depends on who you're talking to. Hercules was a young demigod tasked with many tasks to make himself worthy to the gods. Many know the story, or at least some of the story of Hercules, but not as many of these people know that he has a constellation in the night sky given to him by the gods. Obviously, we know that the stars were there, but Greeks believed that the gods were able to place stars there before, which we know now to be incorrect, but they did not know at the time. Hercules was given many feats to accomplish, some of which including stealing golden apples from a garden, and slaying the Nemean lion. These are significant feats because they were said to have been impossible, and he was still able to do them, and because of his bravery and he was able to prove himself, the gods did in fact place a constellation of him in the sky, so the Greeks believed. Another constellation is Leo. We discussed a little bit previously. There are many constellations and mystical with them, but one of them here is Leo. Leo is a constellation named after the Nemean lion. Now, the Nemean lion was said to have had an impenetrable pelt, or not necessarily impenetrable, but drove weapons away. So it was said that he was impossible to kill. And the gods sent Hercules to go kill him. Now, the thing is that Hercules was able to slay the Nemean lion, and he was also given the pelt as a result. And the Nemean lion has a constellation placed in the sky as a reminder that Hercules was able to slay him. Having covered a little bit of Greek astronomy, we are going to cover some Roman astronomy. Now, Roman astronomers also tied the planets and the stars to their religion and their gods and goddesses. In addition, Romans were able to use the stars to help them discover the seasons and how many months were in a year and such. So Romans discovered for themselves 7 so-called planets. Now I say so-called because we know at this point that they are not all planets, but they assumed at that point that they were all planets. And I say they discovered them for themselves because we obviously know that other civilizations discovered planets as well, but the Romans did not know about this at the time until later on. So the 7 planets that the Romans discovered were Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the moon, and the sun. Now, we know now that the moon and the sun are not, in fact, planets, but it was assumed at the time that they were planets. So Mercury is also known as Mercurius. To the Romans, he was the god of thieves and travelers. Now, you may recognize him as the Greek god Hermes, who was also the god of thieves and travelers. Hermes was also known as the messenger of the gods because he would carry along messages to the gods from heroes and other gods and also monsters. Venus, you may recognize as the goddess of love. Venus is also known to the Greeks as Aphrodite, and Aphrodite and Venus are the same person. Now, Aphrodite and Venus were credited with putting together many relationships and also causing some wars. For example, the Trojan War, where Helen of Troy was basically kidnapped by another man that was from a different country. So she's a little bit of a troublemaker. Mars is known as the god of war to both the Greeks and the Romans. However, the Greeks called him Ares, and the Romans called him Mars. Now, Mars was the god of war because of the red coloring of the planet, which was associated with blood. If you know what Mars looks like, you know it's pretty red, and so the Romans thought, well, let's associate with him with blood because it is red, and blood was associated with war. Now, Jupiter, the largest planet that they had discovered, was king of the gods. Jupiter is known in the Greek culture as Zeus, but to the Romans as Jupiter. He was king of the gods and lord of the skies, lord and god of the skies. It helps that he was a king of the gods because of his size as a planet. Now, Saturn is known as, by the Romans and the Greeks, as the father of Zeus. Now, the Greeks knew Saturn as Kronos and Romans as Saturn. The Romans thought of Saturn as a god, but the Greeks thought of Kronos as a titan and lord of the titans. Now, the moon. We know now that the moon is not a planet, but at the time of the Romans and the Greeks, they just assumed that the moon was a planet because they didn't have any information telling them otherwise. Therefore, it was added to the count of 7 planets that the Romans knew of. Now, the Romans didn't have a god of the moon, but the Greeks did have a goddess of the moon whose name was Artemis, and she was one of the virgin goddesses. Coming up on the sun, just the same as the moon, the Romans assumed that the sun was a planet when, however, it was actually a large star. To the best of the Romans' knowledge, however, the sun was a planet. The Greeks had a god of the sun named Apollo, and also there was some confusion, as there was also Helios. Apollo, however, was the twin brother of Artemis, goddess of the moon. Now, when it comes to telling time, most civilizations had their own version of a year, and not all of them were the same. Now, the Romans, using their astronomical findings, were able to discover that a year for them had 10 months. 6 of those months had 30 days, while the other 4 months had 31 days. However, they soon realized that the seasons were not matching up with the months that they had, and they changed their calendar to include the months of January and February. However, their calendar was still off by a few days, and so they were able to discover even later on that they were still off a little bit. The Mayans. So, the Mayans were super, super detailed in their astrology and astronomy. They were able to actually build a lot of their buildings around astronomy. So if you ever get the chance, I would suggest going to visit some Mayan ruins, and they'll tell you about how it's has to do with astronomy. 1 year. Mayans discovered that a year was 365 days. Other people had also made this discovery, but the Mayans were just discovering it for themselves and were able to do this. This is super important because they knew how to line up their plantings based on when the seasons were and how the seasons changed and everything, because if they planted things in the wrong time, they wouldn't have grown right. Also, the most important planet to the Mayans was the planet Venus. They timed everything around where Venus would be at a specific time, and they used this timing for many things, including when they would start carry on wars, and when they would make their sacrifices, oftentimes being human sacrifices. So they kept pretty close track of where Venus was. Their architecture was, like I said, lined up around where where Venus would be. So many of Mayan buildings were built in accordance to the planets, and some were built with viewing windows in them. So a viewing window was where they could analyze the sky, and they would make their viewing windows to look at specific planets and stars, and celestial events, like the rising or setting of specific planets. And it was pretty meticulous, and it's pretty amazing that they were able to build up their villages with where those planets would be and implement it into their architecture and still have them line up. Now, the Egyptians. The Egyptians are not so quite heard about in astronomy as others like the Greeks and the Mayans and everyone, but they did make some pretty important astronomical findings. The Egyptians were able to use the moon as, first, the death of the pharaohs. So, Egyptians believed that when the pharaohs died, they became stars in the northern sky, and because of this, they oriented their pyramids so that they were facing north. Pretty similar to the Mayans, the Egyptians used astronomy in where they would put their buildings. Not in the same way, but they were able to face them north because they believed it would be an unhindered passage for their pharaohs. Another thing is that the Egyptians were able to use the moon, where the moon would be, to discover when the Nile River would flood, and therefore when to plant their plants on the edge of that, on the bank of that. The Egyptians also discovered that they could use the sun to tell time. They were able to develop sundials that told them what time it was, and the way that the sundials worked is that there was a raised pole in the center, and when the sun shines, it casts a shadow on what hour it was. Now, this was an amazing way to be able to tell time quickly just by looking at a sundial instead of trying to do the math to figure out how long was left in a day. So, all in all, Astronomy was a huge part of ancient civilization and was able to help them survive, and it's still a large part of our civilization now in different ways. The people in ancient times were able to use astronomy to survive and have a greater understanding of the astronomy and they had a greater understanding of astronomy then than most people have now. Astronomy is still a super important subject, and it's important to learn so that we are able to keep learning from our solar system because it has endless amounts of information to offer us. And the more focus we give to astronomy, the more we'll be able to learn, and the better results we'll have when we go out looking for astronomical findings. I really appreciate you taking your time to listen today, and here is a list of the sources that I used in this presentation. Thank you so much.